Picture this. A security researcher is doing routine internet scanning, the digital equivalent of checking unlocked doors on a street, and finds a server with no password on it, inside a spreadsheet. Not of names and birthdays, of usernames, email addresses, and plain text passwords for corporate VPNs. 73,000 of them. Chevron's in there, so is Samsung, Foxconn, Comcast, AT&T, Mercedes-Benz, Toyota, Sinospec, State Grid, some of the largest companies on the planet, sitting in a folder anyone could have stumbled into. I'm Darnley, and this is Darnley Cyber Café. Today we're talking about FortiBleed. And stick with me past the Fortinet headlines because the real lesson here applies whether you've got a FortiGate in your server room or you've never heard the brand before today. All right, let's start with the facts as they broke through. On June 18th, security researcher Bob Diachenko, a name you'll recognize if you follow breach disclosures, he's found more exposed databases than almost anyone in the business, discovered a server sitting on the open internet, and no authentication required. What he found inside looked like a working credential list for Fortinet and FortiGate VPN devices. Usernames, email addresses, and passwords in plain text. Nothing was hashed, nothing was encrypted, it was just sitting there, readable by anyone who found the folder. And this wasn't a random grab bag here. These entries included context, industry, revenue, employee count. These sort of details you would add if you're triaging targets for value, not just hoarding data for fun. Diachenko called it what it looked like, a working list for an active brute force and exploitation campaign. A second researcher, Kevin Beaumont, well known for tracking edge device exploitation, independently reviewed the data. His verdict? At least some of these credentials are real. He confirmed valid logins for multiple organizations himself. So how big is big here? Threat intelligence firm Hudson Rock got the dataset and ran their own numbers. 73,932 unique firewall URLs spanning 194 countries, tied to 21,632 unique domains. Beaumont put this in perspective using Shodan, the search engine that helps catalog internet-connected devices. By his estimate, the leak covered roughly half of every internet-accessible Fortinet firewall on the planet. Half. And majority of those devices have their management interface exposed directly to the internet, which means the login page itself is reachable by anyone, not just authorized administrators on a private network. The list of named organizations reads like a Fortune 500 roll call. Siemens, Lenovo, PwC, Accenture, Oracle, government agencies, critical infrastructure operators. Hudson Rock's breakdown shows telecommunications, IT services, financial services, government, healthcare, education, and manufacturing as the hardest hit sectors. This isn't a niche problem. It cuts across every industry that runs corporate VPNs, which is to say almost all of them. And I'm going to say a detail here that should worry you more than the headline number. Some of these exposed passwords were long and complex, the kind we tell people to use specifically because they're hard to crack. So that tells us something about how this data was likely obtained, which brings us to the how. Diachenko did not stop at the credential list. The same exposed server also contained operational leftovers, connection strings, scripts, cron job logs, bash history, essentially the attacker's own workshop left unlocked. From that, he pieced together a picture from a Russian-speaking multi-operator group running credential attacks at an industrial scale. Roughly 1.1 16 billion login attempts against FortiGate VPN targets, and a separate 2.1 billion attempts against exposed Microsoft SQL Server systems. The claim is that they intercepted the SSL VPN authentication hashes, then cracked them offline using a 45 GPU cluster managed through a tool called HashLapis. Essentially an industrial password cracking infrastructure. Once inside, they allegedly moved laterally through the internal Active Directory environments. Darnley says multiple organizations across Japan, Taiwan, Vietnam, Iraq, and Turkey were fully compromised, including, he claims, a Turkish NATO defense contractor where classified documents were taken. Now, an important caveat is that I want to be straight with you about it. As of this recording, nobody, not Diachenko, not Hudson Rock, not Beaumont, has nailed down exactly how the original Fortinet configuration data was obtained. Beaumont's analysis suggests it was pulled from exported FortiGate configs because the data includes details like email addresses that normally only show up in a config export rather than a basic login form. But whether that came from a previously known Fortinet vulnerability or something new or a plain old credential stuffing is still an open question. This is the one to watch. We'll flag it from here if the picture changes. What I do know is that this is a different, larger data set than last year's Belson's group leak, which exposed about 15,000 FortiGate devices. The IP addresses don't overlap. This is a fresh wave, not a recycled one. Now, here is where I want you to sort of lean in and pay attention, especially if you just thought, quote, great, glad we don't run Fortinet. 3 reasons this matters to you anyway. First, the device, not the brand, is a lesson. FortiGate is having its movement in this story, but it's the underlying failure. An administrative login screen for a VPN or firewall sitting wide open to the public internet. That is not a Fortinet problem. It is an edge device problem. Cisco, Palo Alto, SonicWall, Citrix, every vendor in this category has had its own version of this exact headline. If your organization runs any perimeter device with a web-facing admin panel, this story is about you, just with a different logo. Second, supply chain. Hudson Rock's data shows IT services firms among the hardest hit sectors. Managed service providers and IT vendors are attractive precisely because compromising one gets an attacker a foothold into every client they touch. If your business outsources IT, network equipment, or security monitoring through a third party, their FortiGate or their equivalent is effectively part of your attack surface, whether you see it or not. And third, credential reuse. A chunk of these exposed logins are tied into individual employee email addresses. People reuse passwords, and we all know it. And we all preach against it, but it still happens. If an employee's VPN password shows up in a dump like this, and the same password protects their email, their banking, their personal accounts, the blast radius isn't just contained to one company's firewall, it follows that person. So let me make this practical. If you run Fortinet gear, the to-do list is very direct. Rotate every password tied to your VPN and administrative interfaces immediately. Enforce multi-factor authentication on every remote access point. It's not optional. I don't want to hear, we'll get to it. Just do it. Pull your gateway logs and look for authentication attempts you don't recognize. And check Hudson Rock's free FortiBleed lookup tool. I'll include it in the show's notes to see if your organization's domain shows up in the dataset. And while you're at it, take the management interface off the public internet if you possibly can. Put it behind a VPN of its own. Restrict it to known IP ranges, whatever your architecture allows. An admin login page that the whole internet can see is half the problem in this story right there. Now, if you don't run Fortinet, here's your version of the list. Ask your IT team or your MSP, your managed service provider, one direct question this week or after you listen to this podcast. Do any of our perimeter devices, VPN, firewall, remote access, have an admin interface exposed to the internet? If the answer you get back is yes, or you get the feeling that no one's sure, that is time to put this into action. Check whether your multi-factor authentication is actually enforced, not just available, on every remote access tool your business uses. Ask your vendors and IT providers directly whether they were named or affected in the FortiBleed dataset. It's a fair question, and a responsible vendor will have an answer. And nudge your team, gently but firmly, on password reuse. A password manager and unique credentials per service is still the cheapest insurance policy in cybersecurity. So the uncomfortable truth in this story isn't really the number of 73,000. It's that half of the internet-facing devices in an entire product category were sitting there, reachable, with admin panels exposed, and most still are. That's not a Fortinet failure alone. That is an industry-wide habit we really need to kick. If today's episode gave you something to think about, do me a favor, hit follow, leave a rating, or share this with someone who needs to hear it. It costs you nothing, and it keeps this conversation going. I'm your host, Darnley, and this has been Darnley Cyber Café, where your digital exhaust stops here. Stay sharp, stay private, and remember, the less you leave behind, the less they have on you. Have a safe trip home. We'll see you soon.